wind scraped over the Wyoming prairie, carrying dust and the scent of sage. Elara stood frozen on the creaking porch, her worn valise heavy in her hand. The stagecoach dust still hung in the air behind her, the driver's hurried departure a fading echo. The cabin door yawned open, revealing only shadows within. No welcoming call, no sign of life, just silence, thick and watchful. Inside, the gloom shifted. Sunlight, slicing through a grimy window, fell upon a single stark object, a small, roughly hewn crib. And beside it, pinned by a rusted knife to the rough-hewn table, a scrap of paper trembled in the draft. 2 words, scrawled in a desperate, jagged hand: "Help me." The vast emptiness of the land pressed in, suddenly suffocating. She was utterly alone. Or was she? The journey had been a gauntlet of dust and doubt. 4 days jolting in the stagecoach from Cheyenne, each mile carrying Elara Vance further from the suffocating memories of St. Louis, the cloying scent of decay in her late husband's sick room, the chilling echo of his final grasping breath, the grasping hands of creditors. Wyoming Territory, 1876, offered escape. A harsh landscape, they said, but wide open. A chance to breathe air untainted by regret and fear. Thomas Miller's letters had been her lifeline, practical, kind, promising stability. A homestead near Whispering Pines Creek, he'd written, nestled against the Bighorn foothills. A fresh start for both of them. Now, standing before the reality of it, Elara felt the fragile hope curdle into unease. The stagecoach driver, Jed, a grizzled man smelling of tobacco and horse sweat, had grown increasingly taciturn as the terrain turned wilder. His final words, spat out as he heaved her valise onto the parched earth, rang in her ears. "Miller's place. End of the line, missus. You sure 'bout this? Ain't seen hide nor hair of him at the Crossroads store in near 3 weeks. Place feels watched." He hadn't waited for a reply, just cracked the reins, sending the coach rattling back towards the thin ribbon of civilization miles away. The cabin wasn't what she'd pictured from Thomas's descriptions of solid timber and a warm hearth. It huddled against a sparse grove of wind-bent cottonwoods, dwarfed by the immense brooding shoulders of the mountains beyond. The wood, once perhaps golden pine, was bleached gray and warped by relentless sun and wind. The single window beside the door was grimy, reflecting only the vast empty sky. A crude corral stood empty nearby, its gate hanging askew. Silence, deeper than any she'd known, pressed down, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through the dry grass and the distant cry of a hawk. Gathering her courage, a familiar hard-won habit, Elara stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under her weight like a warning. The door stood slightly ajar. "Hello?" Her voice, thin and swallowed by the immense space, sounded alien. "Thomas Miller?" No answer, only the wind. Pushing the door wider, she stepped into the gloom. The interior was one room, Spartan and functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and lifeless. A rough-hewn table stood near the center, flanked by 2 sturdy chairs. A narrow cot was pushed against another wall, covered with a faded quilt. It was tidy, surprisingly so, but devoid of any personal touch. And cold. The chill seeped into her bones despite the late afternoon sun outside. Then she saw it. In the corner farthest from the door, bathed in a shaft of dusty sunlight, stood a crib. It was small, crudely fashioned from unvarnished pine, but unmistakable. A tiny blanket, hand-knitted in faded blues and yellows, lay neatly folded within it, empty. Utterly, chillingly empty. Her breath hitched. Thomas's letters had mentioned no child. Had he lied? Was this why the driver felt unease? A wave of dizziness washed over her. The ghosts of St. Louis, momentarily replaced by this new, tangible dread. As she forced herself to look away from the haunting crib, her gaze snagged on the table. Something was pinned to its scarred surface. A piece of paper, torn roughly from a larger sheet, held fast by the point of an old skinning knife, driven deep into the wood. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, carefully extracting the knife, its blade dull but heavy in her hand, and lifting the note. 2 words, scrawled in charcoal, or perhaps thick pencil lead, the letters jagged, the pressure deep and uneven. tearing the paper in places, as if written in frantic haste or overwhelming fear. "Help me." No signature, no date, just that stark, desperate plea. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the suffocating silence. Where was Thomas? Who wrote this? Where was the child whose crib stood so silently accusing? The question screamed in her mind, finding no echo in the empty room. A flicker of movement outside the grimy window caught her eye. She spun, heart leaping into her throat. A boy, perhaps 10 or 11, stood at the edge of the cottonwood grove. He was thin, dressed in patched homespun, his face smudged with dirt. He stared at the cabin, his expression unreadable from this distance. Not hostile, perhaps, but watchful, deeply watchful. "Hello?" Elara called again, stepping towards the door, the note crumpling in her fist. "Boy, do you know Thomas Miller?" At the sound of her voice, the boy flinched. He took one step back, then another. His eyes, wide and dark, darted from her to the cabin, then towards the distant mountains. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. With a sudden, rabbit-like turn, he bolted into the grove, vanishing among the shifting shadows of the trees. Gone, like everyone else. Elara sank onto one of the chairs, the worn wood hard beneath her. The note burned in her hand. "Help me." The plea echoed the countless unspoken cries within her own past. She thought of Jed's words. "Place feels watched." She thought of the boy's fearful retreat. She looked around the cold, silent cabin, at the empty crib, at the knife she'd placed on the table, its presence suddenly menacing. Her medical kit, a small leather satchel containing precious herbs, tinctures and bandages salvaged from her old life, rested beside her valise. It was her one tangible skill, honed in necessity. Could she help? Should she even try? Every instinct screamed to flee, to chase after the vanished stagecoach. But where would she go? Back to the debts and the ghosts? Back to nothing? The vast Wyoming sky outside was deepening to lavender, the first stars pricking through. Darkness was coming, and within the four walls of this empty cabin, with its crib and its desperate note, the silence was no longer just empty, it was waiting. Elara Vance, mail-order bride, survivor of one kind of darkness, squared her shoulders. She would not run, not yet. She had to know who needed help, and what unspeakable thing had happened here. The wind moaned around the eaves, carrying the scent of cold earth and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood on the chilling air. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. The first night was falling. The metallic tang Elara had scented wasn't just old blood. It was fear, sharp and primal, coiling in her own throat. The note, crumpled in her fist, felt like a live coal. "Help me." The plea echoed the silent screams she'd swallowed for years in St. Louis. Fleeing back into that void of debt and spectral memories wasn't an option. Not anymore. Wyoming's vast indifference demanded action, not retreat. Survival, honed in the quiet desperation of a sickroom, kicked in. First, light. The cabin's gloom deepened with the fading lavender sky. She rummaged in her valise, past the practical woolen dress and the carefully wrapped daguerreotype of parents long gone, finding the stub of a tallow candle and a tin of lucifers. The scratch of the match was unnervingly loud. The candle flame guttered, then steadied, casting long dancing shadows that made the empty crib seem to sway. Its presence was a physical weight in the room, a silent accusation. Thomas Miller's letters, practical and reassuring, had painted a picture of a solitary man building a life. No mention of a child, ever. The lie or the omission was its own chilling message. Methodically, Elara began searching the single room, the flickering light her only ally against the encroaching night. The tidiness she'd initially noted now felt deliberate, almost staged. The rough-hewn table bore scratches, but nothing unusual. The chairs were sturdy, unremarkable. The cot's faded quilt was neatly tucked. She knelt by the cold fireplace, running fingers over the rough stone. Ash, cold and gray. Nothing hidden beneath. Her gaze kept returning to the crib. Approaching it felt like trespassing. The tiny knitted blanket was soft beneath her fingertips, the yarn worn thin in places. Love had been stitched into it. love, and now absence. As she lifted the blanket, something small and hard fell onto the packed earth floor with a faint clink. A single smooth river stone, deep gray, shot through with a vein of white quartz. A child's treasure. She pocketed it, the cool weight a tangible connection to the unseen occupant. Near the cot, partially obscured by its shadow, she spotted a dark stain on the dirt floor. Not large, but unmistakable. Dried blood. Her healer's mind assessed it. Not a fatal wound perhaps, but significant. It hadn't been cleaned. Had someone tended to it here, hastily, or had the injury occurred amidst something else? Her eyes scanned the walls nearby. Faint, parallel scratches marred the wood, about waist height, like fingernails dragged in panic. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning around the eaves, rattling the loose shutter on the grimy window. It sounded like a lament. The isolation pressed in, heavier than the St. Louis fog. She needed air, a wider view. Pistol, she had none. Her only weapons were wits. The skinning knife from the table now tucked into her belt, its dull edge a cold comfort, and the small medical kit. She blew out the candle, plunging the cabin back into deep twilight, and stepped onto the porch. The vastness of the Wyoming night was staggering. Mountains were jagged black cutouts against a sky blazing with unfamiliar stars. The air was knife cold, scented with sage, pine from the distant grove, and the pervasive dust. Her breath plumed white. To the side of the cabin stood a small, ramshackle barn, its door hanging open like a slack jaw. The empty corral beside it felt like another unanswered question. Where were the animals Thomas surely needed? She approached the barn cautiously, every crunch of gravel under her boots echoing too loudly. Inside, the smell of hay and old manure was strong, undercut by the sour tang of neglect. Empty stalls, a single rusted shovel leaning against a wall, cobwebs draped thickly from the rafters. But in the far corner something caught the starlight filtering through a hole in the roof. A small pile of hay disturbed as if something, or someone, had recently lain there. Kneeling, Elara sifted through the straw. Her fingers closed around something soft and woven, a child's mitten. Small, made of coarse blue wool, well darned at the thumb. Beside it, half buried, lay a twist of paper. Unfolding it carefully, she held it up to the faint light. It was a torn scrap from a larger document, edges jagged, not charcoal this time, but faded ink, in a different, neater hand than the desperate scrawl on the cabin note. Only a fragment remained. Cannot delay. The situation grows untenable. They watch the creek ford constantly. If the supplies don't come by the 15th, we must consider. Sarah is frightened, and the boy. The rest was torn away. Elara's heart thudded. Sarah, the boy, names, proof of lives lived, and now vanished. They watch, Jed's unease, the fleeing boy's terror. It coalesced into a tangible threat. Who were they? Outlaws? Fooding neighbors? Something else? And the 15th? What was the date now? She'd lost track on the stagecoach. Panic threatened to rise, cold and slick, untenable. Frightened, a sound shattered the silence. Not the wind. A sharp, rhythmic crack from the direction of the cottonwood grove, like a branch snapping underfoot. Then another, too deliberate for an animal. Elara froze, crouched in the hay, the fragment of letter clutched in her icy hand. The mitten, the note, the blood, the empty crib, the watching boy. It wasn't just abandonment, it was flight, or capture. And she was here, exposed in this flimsy barn, the only light for miles. The footsteps stopped. Silence descended again, heavier than before. Someone was out there, listening, waiting just beyond the edge of the starlight, hidden by the shifting shadows of the cottonwoods. The metallic scent of fear was back, thick in her own mouth. Every nerve screamed to run, to vanish into the vast darkness. But where? And what of Sarah, the boy? The plea for help? She held her breath, straining to hear over the frantic drumming of her own heart. A low whistle, soft and mournful, drifted from the grove. Not a bird, a signal. Her hand tightened on the knife handle. The vast, indifferent stars watched. The night held its breath. Whoever was out there wasn't leaving. They were closing in. The isolation was no longer just emptiness. It was a trap snapping shut, and Elara Vance was squarely in its jaws. The mournful whistle hung in the frigid air, a serpent coiling around Elara's spine. Every instinct screamed hide. The barn's flimsy walls offered scant protection, the open door a gaping maw. She pressed herself deeper into the hay pile's meager shadow, the rough stalks pricking her skin through her dress. The skinning knife, cold and unfamiliar in her grip, felt like a child's toy against the vast, watchful darkness. Her breath came in shallow, silent gasps, fogging the air before her face. They watched the creek ford constantly. The words from the torn letter fragment burned in her mind. Was the Whistler one of them? The owner of those deliberate footsteps? Silence descended again, deeper and more oppressive than before. The wind sighed through the cottonwoods, masking any further sound. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The immense indifference of the starlit landscape felt like a physical weight. Was someone out there, patient as a spider, waiting for her to move, or had the Whistler been signaling someone else? Unseen. A faint rustle, closer than the grove. Directly outside the barn door, Elara's knuckles whitened on the knife handle. A shadow detached itself from the deeper blackness of the cottonwoods, small and hunched. It paused, silhouetted against the indigo sky, then darted forward with surprising speed, not towards the barn, but towards the cabin's porch. The boy, the same thin patched figure who had fled earlier. He moved with a desperate, furtive energy, glancing constantly over his shoulder towards the grove. He scrambled onto the porch, then vanished through the cabin's still open door. What was he doing? Retrieving something? Hiding? Was he connected to the Whistler, or fleeing from the same threat? Elara made a decision, swift and born of the same desperation that had propelled her onto the stagecoach west. She couldn't stay paralyzed in the barn. If the boy knew something, he was her only link to the truth behind the note. The crib, the blood. And if he was in danger, the plea "help me" resonated too deeply within her own history of helplessness. Gripping the knife low at her side, she slipped out of the barn, keeping to the inky pools of shadow cast by the cabin and corral. The cold earth bit through her thin boots. Every crunch of gravel sounded like a gunshot in her ears. She reached the cabin wall, pressing her back against the rough, cold logs, listening. From inside, a frantic scrabbling sound. A drawer opened, then slammed shut. A muffled sob, quickly stifled. He was terrified. Taking a breath that tasted of dust and sage, Elara stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned treacherously. The scrabbling inside stopped dead. She pushed the door open wider, the candle she'd left extinguished, leaving the interior pitch black, save for the weak starlight from the window. "Boy," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's the woman from before. Elara, I won't hurt you." A sharp intake of breath came from near the fireplace. She could just make out his small shape, frozen, pressed against the stones. His eyes gleamed wide with reflected starlight, feral with fear. "Who are you?" she asked softly, taking one slow step inside, keeping the knife hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Do you know Thomas Miller? Sarah? The child?" At the names the boy flinched violently. "They took him," he blurted, his voice cracking with panic. "The bad men. Days ago. Sarah told me to run, to hide in the root cellar down by the creek, but I came back for Ma's locket." He clutched something small and metallic to his chest. Elara's heart hammered. "Who took them? Who are the bad men?" Before he could answer, a new sound cut through the night, the distant rhythmic thud of hoofbeats. Several horses, moving fast, approaching from the direction of the creek ford. The boy whimpered, shrinking back. "They're comin', they patrol at night. They seen the smoke earlier, I bet." Smoke. Elara realized with a jolt, her single match, lighting the candle. A tiny signal in the vastness, noticed. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, vibrating through the floorboards. Time was collapsing. Fleeing into the open prairie now was suicide. The root cellar, where was it? The cellar, by the creek. "Can we get there?" The boy nodded frantically, pointing a trembling finger south. "But they'll see us cross the open." The riders were close now, maybe half a mile away, the drumming of hooves a relentless heartbeat of menace. Elara scanned the dark cabin, her medical kit, It was still by her valise near the door. Instinct took over. In St. Louis, hiding the last of her coin from her husband's creditors had been a grim necessity. She snatched the kit, then grabbed the boy's thin arm. He was trembling like a leaf. "Show me. Now." Fast and quiet. They burst out the back door, away from the approaching riders, plunging into the deeper shadows behind the cabin. The open ground sloped down towards the faint silvery glint of Whispering Pines Creek, about 200 yards away. A moonscape of sagebrush and rocks under the cold stars. "No cover. Run," Elara hissed, pushing the boy ahead of her. They scrambled down the slope, boots skidding on loose gravel. The hoofbeats were terrifyingly close now, rounding the bend near the cottonwood grove. Shouts carried on the wind, rough male voices. "See? Told ya." Light in the window. "Spread out. Check the buildings." Elara risked a glance back. Dark shapes, at least 4 riders, silhouetted against the skyline near the cabin, dismounting. Torches flared to life, casting long leaping shadows. They were searching. The boy, gasping, veered left towards a thick patch of willow saplings clinging to the creek bank. "Here." The door's hidden. He scrambled down a short muddy bank and vanished into the foliage. Elara followed, slipping on the damp earth, plunging into the damp earthy smell of the willows. The boy was frantically clearing dead branches and leaves from a low sod-covered mound set into the bank. A crude wooden door, nearly invisible. He yanked it open, revealing a black hole smelling of damp earth and rot. "Get in," he urged, his voice tight with terror. Elara pushed him in first, then squeezed through after him, pulling the heavy door shut, just as torchlight washed over the willows above them. She fumbled in the pitch blackness, her fingers finding the crude wooden latch and sliding it home. Outside, the tramp of heavy boots approached the creek bank, the torchlight flickering through the chinks in the door. Muffled voices drifted down. "Nothin' down here but crick and willows. Check them bushes proper. I ain't ridin' all this way for nothin'. Footprints. Headin' down here fresh." Elara pressed her back against the cold earthen wall of the tiny root cellar, the boy trembling beside her. Her hand found his, small and icy. In the stifling darkness, the only sound was their ragged breathing and the ominous scrape of boots just feet away, searching. The knife felt useless now. They were trapped. The bad men were right outside, and the only thing separating them from discovery was a flimsy door and a tangle of willows. The note's plea echoed in the suffocating dark. "Help me." But who was left to help them? The boy's choked sob beside her was the only answer. The damp, earthy smell of the root cellar was thick with terror. Boots scuffed the ground mere feet above them on the creek bank, the flickering torchlight painting jagged stripes of orange through the cracks in the crude wooden door. Elara pressed her hand firmly over the boy's mouth, feeling the frantic hammer of his pulse against her palm, the choked whimpers vibrating against her skin. Her own breath hitched in her throat, tasting of loam and cold fear. "Help me." The plea wasn't just on paper anymore. It was the frantic rhythm of 2 hearts trapped in the suffocating dark. "Footprints lead right down here, Jedediah," a rough voice snarled above. "Fresh, like I said. Probably just some varmint, Caleb. Or that damn half-wild Injun boy that hangs round Miller's place. Nothin' but trouble. Miller's place ain't Miller's no more, is it? Silas wants it checked proper." Light was seen. Could be stragglers. Or that damn woman Miller wrote east for. Elara's blood ran cold. That damn woman, her. They knew about her. Thomas had mentioned her coming. Had that sealed his fate? Sarah's? The child's? The boy stiffened in her grip at the mention of Silas, a fresh wave of trembling shaking his small frame. "Check them willows," Jedediah barked. "Poke around, ain't got all night." A heavy boot kicked at the thicket of willows shielding the cellar door. Branches snapped close overhead. Elara flinched, pulling the boy tighter against the cold earthen wall. Her free hand found the skinning knife, its dull edge offering little reassurance against the brutal strength above. She remembered the blood stain in the cabin, the scratches on the wall, the violence these men were capable of. The memory of her husband's final gasping rage in St. Louis, the broken bottle, the searing pain on her forearm, the helplessness, surged back, a phantom ache beneath her sleeve. She wouldn't be helpless again. Not for herself. Not for this child. The probing above became more vigorous. A rifle butt slammed into the willow thicket directly over the door. Dirt showered down on them. The boy whimpered again, a sound of pure animal fear. Suddenly, a shout echoed from the direction of the cabin. "Jed, Caleb, rider comin' fast from the south trail. Looks like one of Silas's boys." The activity above them ceased instantly. "Damn it," Jedediah cursed. "All right, mount up, leave this gully. Rider might have news. Move." Boots pounded away up the bank. The torchlight receded, swallowed by the night. The drumming of hooves resumed. Frantic now, heading back towards the cabin and the approaching rider. Silence descended, deeper and more profound than before, broken only by the frantic rush of Whispering Pines Creek nearby, and their own ragged breathing. Elara slowly, cautiously, removed her hand from the boy's mouth. He gulped air, coughing softly. "They gone," he whispered, his voice raw. "For now," Elara breathed, her muscles trembling with released tension. "We can't stay. They might come back." She fumbled for the wooden latch in the pitch blackness, her fingers numb with cold and fear. It slid free with a rusty scrape. Pushing the heavy door open a crack, she peered out. Starlight illuminated the empty creek bank, the willows stirring gently. The sounds of the riders were fading into the distance towards the cabin. "Quickly," she urged, scrambling out and helping the boy up. The cold night air was a shock, clean and sharp after the cellar's dankness. "What's your name, son?" "Ben," he mumbled, wiping his face with a grimy sleeve. "Ben Carter. Sarah. Sarah's my sister. The baby, little Liza, she's mine too." His voice cracked on the last words. "They took 'em 3 days back. Men workin' for Silas Rark. He wants Thomas's land. The creek ford's here. Thomas wouldn't sell, said it was his future. Yours too, I reckon." Silas Rark, the name from the men above. Land. A motive, brutal and simple. Thomas's stubborn hope for a future had painted a target on them all, including her. Elara scanned the dark slope towards the cabin. Torchlight still flickered there. The riders had met the newcomer. They were regrouping, searching. "We need to get away from here," Elara said, urgency sharpening her voice. "Is there somewhere safer? Somewhere Silas's men wouldn't look?" Ben nodded, pointing shakily towards the looming blackness of the foothills rising steeply beyond the creek. "Old Trapper's Line Shack. High up. Thomas showed me once. Hard climb. But they won't go up there at night. Mountain lions." It was a gamble. Exhaustion pulled at Elara's limbs, and Ben looked near collapse. But staying meant capture, or worse. Remembering her medical kit, she pulled out a small pungent jar of hartshorn ammonia. "Here," she said, uncorking it and holding it briefly under Ben's nose. He jerked back, eyes watering, but some of the day's terror cleared from his face. "Keep moving. Don't look back." They splashed across the icy shallows of Whispering Pines Creek, the water soaking their boots and skirts, stealing their breath. Elara kept a tight grip on Ben's hand, pulling him up the steep rocky bank on the other side. They scrambled into the sparse cover of scrub pine and boulders at the base of the foothills, leaving the exposed creek bottom behind. The climb was brutal, every step an agony on the uneven terrain. Elara's lungs burned. Ben stumbled frequently, his thin frame shaking with effort and cold. Halfway up a particularly steep scree slope, Ben's foot slipped on loose rock. He cried out, falling hard, dragging Elara down with him. They skidded several feet before fetching up against a large boulder. Pain lanced through Elara's knee. Ben lay gasping, clutching his ankle, a low moan escaping him. "Ben, are you hurt?" Elara crawled to him, ignoring her own pain. "My ankle," he whimpered. "Twisted it bad." Elara gently probed the joint in the dim starlight. Swelling was already starting. Not broken, hopefully, but a bad sprain. Walking, let alone climbing, would be agony. She looked down the slope they'd just climbed. The cabin was a tiny distant speck of torchlight far below. They were exposed on this barren mountainside. Dawn was hours away, and with it, the likelihood of Silas Rark's men expanding their search. As she rummaged in her medical kit for a bandage to immobilize the ankle, Her hand brushed against something hard and rectangular tucked deep inside, beneath the rolls of linen, something that hadn't been there before. Pulling it out, she saw it was a small leather-bound book, its cover stained with dirt, and something darker. Thomas Miller's name was tooled faintly on the front. A journal. Her breath caught. When? How? Ben must have grabbed it from the cabin during his frantic search for his mother's locket, and shoved it into her open kit. When they fled. Answers. Maybe. But before she could open it, a new sound froze her blood. Not hoofbeats, not shouts. From far below, near the creek they'd crossed, came the chilling, guttural cough of a mountain lion. Close, and it was answered by another, higher up the slope, somewhere in the darkness above them. The trapper's shack was still a perilous climb away. Ben was injured, and the predators of the bighorns knew fresh meat was stranded on their mountain. The torches of men seemed a distant threat compared to the ancient hungry eyes now watching from the shadows. The guttural cough of the mountain lion echoed off the bighorn foothills, a primal threat that drowned the distant flicker of Silas Rourke's torches below. Elara Vance crouched beside Ben on the frost-slick scree, her breath pluming in the frigid Wyoming night. Ben's twisted ankle throbbed under her makeshift bandage, his small face pale with pain and terror. Thomas Miller's journal, its leather cover stained with blood, pressed against her ribs inside her medical kit, a fragile promise of answers. The help me note, crumpled in her pocket, burned like a brand. Above them, the trapper's shack was a shadow against the jagged peaks too far for a crippled boy and a woman running on sheer will. Below, Rourke's men regrouped, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. And now, the lions, hungry, unseen, circling. Elara's hand tightened on the skinning knife. Her forearm ached, the scar from her husband's last rage in St. Louis a reminder of survival. She'd fled that darkness, crossed a continent to escape helplessness. She wouldn't let Ben, Sarah, or little Liza fall to it. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her voice steady, despite the fear clawing her chest. Ben nodded, clutching his mother's locket, his eyes wide with trust she wasn't sure she deserved. A rustle in the scrub pine above snapped her gaze upward. Yellow eyes gleamed in the starlight, low and unblinking. The lion's silhouette was massive, its tail twitching. Another cough answered from below. Closer now, two predators, stalking in tandem. Elara's mind raced. Fire? She had matches, but no kindling on this barren slope. Noise. It might scare the lions but would draw Rourke's men. Her medical kit, she fumbled it open, fingers numb, and grabbed the jar of hartshorn ammonia. Its acrid scent might deter the beasts. She uncorked it, splashing the liquid onto the rocks around them. The sharp smell stung her eyes. The lion above froze, ears flattening, then retreated into the shadows with a low snarl. The second lion's cough grew fainter, hesitating. It worked, for now, but the reprieve was fleeting. Ben's breathing was ragged, his ankles swelling worse. They couldn't stay exposed. "We need to move," Elara said, helping Ben up. He leaned heavily on her, biting back a cry. The trapper's shack was their only chance. They stumbled upward, each step a battle against pain and gravity. The journal slipped slightly, and Elara caught a glimpse of Thomas's tight script in the starlight. She hadn't had time to read it, but its weight felt like truth, maybe the key to everything. As they neared the shack, a faint glow flickered through its warped boards. Elara's heart leapt. Someone was inside. Friend or foe? She eased Ben behind a boulder, knife ready, and crept forward. The shack was a crumbling relic, its door ajar. Inside, a single candle burned, casting light on a figure hunched over a makeshift pallet. A woman, her face gaunt, cradled a small fussing bundle. Sarah and Liza. Elara pushed the door open, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Sarah, I'm Elara Vance. Ben's with me." Sarah's head snapped up, eyes wild with fear, then softening as she saw Elara. "You came for Thomas?" Her voice broke. Liza whimpered, a tiny sound that pierced the night. Before Elara could answer, a twig snapped outside. She spun, knife raised, as a man staggered into the doorway, his face bloodied, one arm hanging limp. Thomas Miller, his eyes, fever bright, locked on Elara. "You, the bride," he gasped. I wrote the note, tried to warn you, Silas. His knees buckled. Elara caught him, easing him to the floor. Her medical training kicked in. His arm was broken, a gash on his temple oozing blood. She tore strips from her petticoat, binding the wounds as Thomas rasped out the truth. Silas Rourke, a cattle baron, coveted the creek ford on Thomas's land for his herds. When Thomas refused to sell, Rourke's men attacked. Thomas had hidden Sarah and Liza, left the note, and fled to draw the men away, but they'd caught him, beaten him near death. He'd escaped, tracked Sarah to the shack, but Rourke's men were closing in. They burned the barn to flush us out, Sarah whispered, clutching Liza. Ben ran to warn us. Elara's gaze flicked to the journal. She opened it, scanning Thomas's final entry. Silas claims a deed from 72, forged. The ford's ours. If I fall, tell Pastor Ellis in town. He'll fight for you. A plan formed. Pastor Ellis, town, safety. But hoofbeats thundered below, closer now. Rourke's men had spotted their trail, and the lions. Elara heard a snarl, too near. Time was gone. Ben, can you walk? Elara asked, helping him inside. He nodded, grimacing. Sarah, carry Liza. Thomas, lean on me. She doused the candle, plunging them into darkness. They slipped out the back, using the shack's shadow to skirt the slope toward a narrow game trail Thomas whispered of, leading to town. The lions struck first. A scream tore the night as one of Rourke's men, lagging behind, was dragged into the scrub. Chaos erupted. Shouts, gunfire, horses rearing. The distraction bought them time. Elara led the group down the trail, her arm burning under Thomas's weight. Ben limped beside Sarah, Liza's cries muffled against her mother's chest. Dawn broke, painting the prairie gold. The trail widened, and the distant rooftops of whispering pines appeared. Rourke's surviving men, spooked by the lions, had fallen back. Elara's legs trembled, but she pressed on. At the town's edge, Pastor Ellis met them, alerted by a trapper who'd seen their flight. He took the journal, promising justice for Thomas's land. Elara sat on the church steps, Ben beside her, his locket glinting. Sarah rocked Liza nearby, Thomas resting under the pastor's care. The scar on Elara's forearm, once a mark of shame, felt like a badge of survival. She'd come west to escape, but found a purpose, protecting this fragile family. She'd stay, not as Thomas's bride, but as herself. Elara Vance, unbroken. The Wyoming wind carried sage and promise. Silas Rourke's shadow lingered, but Elara faced it unflinching. She'd answered the note's plea, and in doing so, saved herself.